Hello, this is Kyrasis, and in this Blood Death Knight analysis video, we are going to talk about Death's Caress and Downtime. Because, in the early days of this expansion, there seemed to be a lot of misinformation going around about Death's Caress. So, we are going to take a look at Death's Caress and Marrowrend as they function now in Dragonflight, how Downtime currently affects the Blood Death Knight rotation, what actually happens when you try to use Death's Caress in place of Morrowind in the rotation, and the actual optimal usage of Death's Caress. As you probably know, Death's Caress was changed in Dragonflight to generate 2 Bone Shield charges per use at the cost of a 6-second cooldown when it was changed from a base ability in Shadowlands and into a Dragonflight talent. While I'd argue the added cooldown is mostly unnecessary, this change led to a valid question. Is there any merit to using Death's Caress in place of Marrowrend as a Bone Shield generator? Now, when this question was originally being asked, Marrowrend did less damage and we didn't even know what the tier set bonuses were going to be for Blood Death Knights. So, for the purposes of this example, I'm going to use an older tooltip for Marrowrend that represents how strong it was at the time. If you looked up this ability on Wowhead today, you would notice it has higher attack power coefficient after some buffs we received later in the beta. In any case, if you look at both the Bone Shield charges generated and effective attack power per rune on both abilities, you will notice that Death's Caress wins on both counts. Just keep in mind that, because Morrowrend is physical damage instead of magic damage, it gets reduced by an additional 30% to account for armor so that the numbers are comparable. And if you just stopped here, you could mistakenly come to the impression that Death's Caress was better than Marrowrend in all situations. But there's one thing we haven't talked about yet, and that's how much cast time is involved with both abilities. And to spend the same amount of runes, or to generate the same amount of Bone Shield charges, you will need to spend significantly more cast time on Death's Caress than Morrowrend, making it slower to spend runes and slower to generate Bone Shield. So, at this point, I need to give a little more context. When people are talking about downtime, we are generally talking about the percentage of cast time that you are not casting any abilities. And we are generally taking this number in relation to what our downtime looks like in long duration simulations in Simulation Craft or from infinite duration steady state models. And if we just take a look at recent expansions, Blood Death Knight usually has somewhere between 0 and 15% downtime, depending on the exact patch we are talking about. And much like the end of Shadowlands, we are actually in a situation in patch 10.0 where our downtime is very close to 0, if not actually 0, due to a number of reasons that we don't really need to get into for the purposes of this video, though I've listed a few of them at the bottom of the slide. In short, it is mostly because of the extra resource regeneration and cheaper death strikes that have allowed us to remain in a very low downtime situation, even after losing the patch 9.2 tier set bonuses that originally removed our downtime at the end of Shadowlands with insanely high dancing weapon uptimes. Regardless, let us look at considerations for when we have a respectable amount of downtime in our rotation. A major part of playing Blood Death Knight in this situation is maximizing all of our resource usage as efficiently as possible. The first part of this is minimizing runic power waste as much as possible to maximize our death strike throughput, at least within reason since you still need to maintain a healthy runic power pool to function effectively. Second, up to 3 runes can be on cooldown at any given time, so we want to try to keep our rune count at 3 or lower as much as possible so that we are maximizing new rune regeneration that can be used to generate more runic power. Third, we can only have 2 charges of Blood Boil at any given time, so we want to, at the very least, stay below 2 charges as much as possible so new charges are constantly being generated. So, for the sake of maximizing our offensive and defensive throughput, these 3 things should be on your mind, and they are generally prioritized in this order, in most patches, and under most circumstances. I would consider this the standard approach to maximizing resource efficiency. This approach prioritizes single target damage and raw death strike throughput, while a more complicated variant could be used to increase AoE damage situationally, though we won't be going into the details of that in this video. Now, in situations where we have little to no downtime built into our rotation, blood has some new considerations, because now it is impossible for us to maximize the use of all of our resources at the same time. So, there are two main things to keep in mind. First, if we are ever comparing two setups where one setup requires more cast time than the other to execute, the extra cast time you're spending is coming at the cost of losing casts of either Death Strike, Heart Strike, or Blood Boil. While you do have some control over which of these three you are giving up, you will generally be losing Blood Boils if you are playing in a standard fashion. And this is where we finally come back full circle to Death's Caress, where the extra cast time involved in using Death's Caress to replace Marrowrend would now come at the cost of other ability casts, since we have no rotation downtime. And while it's not the primary target of this video, this situation is actually beneficial towards Rune Tap, since despite Rune Tap not being a very rune efficient generator of runic power, Rune Tap is an instant cast ability that frees up cast time that can be used on Blood Boil or other core abilities. However, there is a second implication that also matters in this discussion. With no downtime, the relative priorities between our core abilities now have a large impact on how many hard strikes, blood boils, and death strikes we are able to cast over time. The next few slides should hopefully explain what I'm talking about with the second point, as well as why it is important. Remember these standard resource maximization goals from the previous slide? What do you think happens when you aggressively replace Marrowrend with Death's Caress in an otherwise standard rotation? Well, not only do you not see a significant increase in damage, but you also don't see a significant increase in Death Strike throughput either. Now, you might be finding this a little weird if you remember the earlier slides. The entire argument for Death's Caress in the first place is that it is a more rune-efficient generator of Bone Shield charges. And by using less runes on Bone Shield generation, we should have more runes to spend on Heart Strike, which is just superior to our Bone Shield generators at just about everything other than the fact that it doesn't generate Bone Shield charges. And more Heart Strikes will ultimately mean more Death Strikes. So, even if we are not seeing any more damage, why are we not seeing more Death Strikes with a Death's Caress setup? Now, if you look closely at any optimized priority list, you will generally see the following three priorities show up in this order. Using Death Strike when your runic power goes above a certain level, using Heart Strike when you have or are about to have more than 3 runes, and using Blood Boil when you have or are close to having 2 charges of Blood Boil. There are obviously other priorities in the full Blood Death Knight rotation, but only these three matter for this immediate discussion. As it turns out, if you want to actually see increased Death Strike throughput with a Death's Caress heavy rotation, you're going to actually need to further emphasize rune usage at the expense of blood boils. And we can do this by more aggressively spending runes before we worry about using our blood boil charges. Just keep in mind that this is not something that you would normally want to be doing with your rotation. So, now that we have a more rune-centric priority for this example, what happens if we, once again, try to substitute Marrowrend cast for Death's Caress with this one tweak? Now, we finally see that increase in Death Strike frequency we were expecting before, though it comes at the cost of more damage than before, especially on multiple targets where the Lost Blood Boil casts are more impactful. And, at least with the numbers that were at play here, the increase in Death Strike frequency is not to the extent where the damage loss seems worthwhile. There are additional downsides to Death's Caress usage of Marrowrend as well that aren't captured in the simulations and models. One, real-world situations mean that we potentially need to use cast time on utility abilities that aren't being used in simulations or models, which further reduces our downtime. Two, shorter duration encounters put more emphasis on spending resources quickly, since we are generally entering encounters with high or full resources at the very start of the encounter. Three, in real-world situations, we won't be in melee 100% of the time, which, in addition to increasing our resource backlog, we'd prefer Death's Caress to be off cooldown for those moments when you're forced out of melee range, since Death's Caress is still usable under those circumstances. And finally, Blood Death Knights players are already conditioned to use Marrowrend as usual. So any argument in favor of more Death's Caress usage will need sufficient evidence of being a significant benefit to justify changing the status quo, because everyone is already used to using Marrowrend. Now, it's important that I identify what these heavy Death's Caress profiles are being compared to, because the baseline profile is still using Death's Caress. It is just being a lot smarter about it. Looking back at this original comparison slide, the main downside to Death's Caress is that it is a cast time inefficient method of spending our runes and generating bone shield charges. But there are a few situations where that just doesn't matter. 1. If Death's Caress is at the absolute bottom of your priority list, you are only using it when you would otherwise be using nothing else with that cast time. Then it ends up being a minor gain over not using Death's Caress at all, because there is nothing else to compete with. The second point is really just an extension of the first point. If you are stuck at range, then you are greatly limited in what you are able to cast, so you very quickly get put into a situation where Death's Caress isn't competing for cast time with any other ability. So, as long as you're at least getting some productive bone shield generation out of these casts of Death's Caress, these uses can actually increase both your damage and death strike frequency, if only by a little bit. This currently looks like the best method of using Death's Caress. In conclusion, we reviewed the key differences between Death's Caress and Marrowrend. We talked about how the current low uptime of the specialization affects the Blood Death Knight rotation. We explained why Death's Caress is generally inferior to Marrowrend, and then we identified what optimal Death's Caress usage looks like. If you would like to make it easier for other people to find this content, feel free to upvote this video or subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions, if there is anything you would like to see in the future, or if you have any opinions of your own about Death's Caress, I'd like to hear what you have to say in the comments. I can usually respond to any question that shows up in the comments. I can also be contacted through Discord, and my information can be found in the video description below. In the meantime, good luck and have fun.